The morning sun had just started to peek over the city's horizon when Sarah Thompson's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m. She wasn't just any lawyer rushing to court. She was a dedicated public defender who had worked her way through law school while holding down two jobs. Like every other day, Sarah's structured routine kept her centered. Living in her modest two-bedroom apartment on the city's east side, Sarah moved through her morning ritual with ease. Her natural hair was styled neatly in small twists, a look she had perfected over years of balancing professionalism and personal identity. She selected her outfit carefully, a navy blue suit bought during a Macy's sale, paired with practical yet polished black heels. The kitchen counter was cluttered with case files she'd been reviewing late into the night. She poured coffee into her travel mug, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen as she gathered her papers. Carefully organizing them into her worn leather briefcase, a treasured graduation gift from her supportive parents, Sarah reminded herself that today was different. Her colleague Mark was sick, and she had to cover his cases in Courtroom 3B. Rumors about Judge Henderson, who presided there, made Sarah wary. The older white judge was known for his strict enforcement of courtroom protocol and punctuality. Sarah checked her watch. 7:15 a.m. Heavy traffic was inevitable, but she had planned ahead. She grabbed her keys, her coffee, and her trusty leather briefcase before heading out the door. Her reliable Honda Civic, far from fancy but dependable, had been with her through 3 years of law school and now 5 years of defending clients. As she navigated the already busy city streets, Sarah mentally reviewed the 6 cases she had to handle that day. Each defendant had their own struggles, their own story. At a red light, Sarah glanced at her phone. 3 new emails had arrived from clients' families, along with a text from her mother wishing her luck for the day. By 8:10 a.m., she pulled into the courthouse parking lot. With 50 minutes until her first case, Sarah felt confident. The courthouse steps were already bustling with lawyers, staff, and defendants. Familiar faces exchanged quick greetings with Sarah as she navigated through the crowd. Security lines were slow, and Sarah watched private attorneys breeze through a separate, faster line, an unavoidable reminder of the different worlds within the justice system. Finally, it was her turn. She placed her briefcase on the conveyor belt, removed her shoes, and walked through the metal detector. Inside, the courthouse was a hive of activity. Sarah stopped by the public defender's office on the second floor, checking her mailbox for any last-minute updates. The office buzzed with ringing phones, humming copy machines, and exhausted attorneys sipping coffee. Her colleague Jessica rushed past, then backtracked. "Hey, Sarah, just a heads up. Henderson's in a mood today. Something about his car breaking down." Sarah nodded, grateful for the warning. It wasn't uncommon for public defenders to share critical courthouse intel. They looked out for one another. A quick check of her watch showed 8:45 a.m., and Sarah hurried toward Courtroom 3B to prep for her cases. The benches outside were crowded with anxious defendants and their families. Spotting one of her clients, a young man facing a minor drug charge, Sarah offered a reassuring nod before sitting down to organize her files. Each folder in her briefcase represented more than paperwork. It held someone's future. She had chosen this job not for the money, which paled in comparison to private practice, but because she believed in providing a fair defense to all. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3B. Sarah waited as attorneys filed in, noticing she was one of only 3 black professionals in the packed room. Just as she prepared to enter, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her client in Courtroom 2A needed immediate assistance with a plea deal. Knowing the situation was critical, Sarah quickly messaged the clerk in 3B, explaining she'd be slightly delayed. Unbeknownst to her, the message went unnoticed. Inside Courtroom 3B, Judge Richard Henderson sat towering on his elevated bench. With his silver hair and black robe, he looked every bit the intimidating figure. His sour mood, caused by car trouble that morning, worsened as he scanned the packed courtroom calendar. Henderson prided himself on punctuality and despised tardiness. When Sarah finally entered the courtroom at 9:20 a.m., Judge Henderson was already in the middle of his announcements. The heavy doors echoed loudly as they closed behind her, drawing every eye to Sarah as she walked toward the defense table. Young lady, Judge Henderson's voice boomed, his steel-gray eyes glaring at her. Do you know what time it is? The room fell completely silent, the tension palpable. Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but Henderson cut her off with a raised hand. The defendant's area is over there, he said, pointing to the benches. I don't know what kind of tardiness you're used to, but in my courtroom, we respect time. Several attorneys recognized Sarah, but remained silent. The bailiff, distracted by paperwork, missed the exchange. Do you understand what contempt of court means? Judge Henderson continued, his tone dripping with condescension. Being 20 minutes late is exactly that kind of disrespect. Sarah maintained her composure, standing tall as whispers spread across the room. Phones discreetly emerged despite the courthouse ban on recording. I'm going to fine you $500 for contempt, Henderson declared, his gavel poised in the air. Before he could bring it down, Sarah spoke clearly, her voice calm and steady. Your Honor, if I may. Henderson wasn't finished. And where is your attorney? Don't tell me you're representing yourself, he sneered. Sarah's hands moved to her briefcase. She carefully laid out her credentials, her bar card, court ID, case files, and appointment letter as a public defender. The prosecutor, who recognized Sarah, began to rise, but Judge Henderson waved him down. I don't know what you think you're doing, Henderson barked. My name is Sarah Thompson, Sarah said firmly. I'm a public defender, and I have 6 cases on your docket this morning. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the silent courtroom. Judge Henderson's gavel remained frozen midair, as though suspended by the shock rippling through the room. Sarah Thompson stood at the defense table, her posture impeccable, her hands carefully arranging the documents that now lay before her. Her bar card, her official court ID, her appointment letter as a public defender, and the files for her 6 clients on that morning's docket. For a moment, Judge Henderson stared at the credentials in disbelief, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as his pride wrestled with the reality unfolding before him. The courtroom gallery buzzed with low murmurs. Some whispered in awe of Sarah's composure. Others exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the judge's blunder. Several spectators couldn't resist sneaking their phones out again, despite the courthouse's strict no-recording policy. The prosecutor, Tom Martinez, stood fully now, his tall frame drawing the judge's eye. Your Honor, he said carefully, his voice measured as though testing fragile ground. This is Sarah Thompson. She's been with the Public Defender's Office for 5 years, and she's here covering Mark Wilson's cases today. The tension in the room crackled as Judge Henderson processed Tom's words. His gaze moved from Sarah's face to the credentials spread across the wooden table and then back again. Slowly, his hand lowered, the gavel making a soft thud as it returned to its resting place. The slight tremor in his hand didn't go unnoticed by those closest to the bench. I see, Judge Henderson said, his voice less firm now, edged with something that sounded like hesitation, or perhaps shame. Sarah, despite the fire of humiliation burning in her chest, remained the picture of professionalism. Her navy blue suit was crisp, her natural twists perfectly styled, and her face, calm and composed, betrayed none of the hurt or anger she felt beneath the surface. Years of navigating difficult courtrooms and prejudiced assumptions had prepared her for moments like this. Your Honor, Sarah spoke again, her voice steady but carrying a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. I apologize for my slight delay this morning. I had an urgent matter in courtroom 2A with another client. I sent notice to the clerk's office, though I understand it may not have been received in time. The courtroom clerk, Jenny Martinez, glanced up abruptly, her face paling as she realized her oversight. Hurriedly, she began clicking through her email inbox, the frantic tapping of keys audible in the still room. Your Honor, she stammered, her voice small but clear. Miss Thompson's message is here. She did notify us. The color drained from Judge Henderson's face, the red tint of anger replaced by the pallor of embarrassment. A deep silence fell over the room once more, broken only by the faint scratching of the court reporter's stenotype machine. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit developed over decades on the bench, as he tried to regain control of the moment. But the damage was already done. The gallery, packed with defendants, their families, and fellow attorneys, had witnessed every second of the exchange. Sarah's poised response, her clear qualifications, and the judge's evident misjudgment had painted a picture far more powerful than words alone. "Miss Thompson," Judge Henderson finally said, his voice strained but quieter now, "I see that I may have acted prematurely." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the court clerk, then back to Sarah. "It appears there was a miscommunication." Tom Martinez, the prosecutor, didn't sit down. Instead, he kept his attention on Sarah, an unspoken show of support that did not go unnoticed. The other attorneys in the room, many of whom had worked alongside Sarah in different cases, exchanged subtle nods of approval and respect. "Your Honor," Sarah responded evenly, meeting the judge's eyes with quiet confidence. "If I may proceed, I have 6 cases on your docket today, beginning with State versus Marcus Johnson." She gestured toward her client, a young man who sat watching the proceedings with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Judge Henderson hesitated for only a moment before nodding stiffly. "Very well, Miss Thompson. Let's proceed with the morning's cases." As Sarah picked up her case file and began outlining her client's defense, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. The gallery, moments before buzzing with judgment and whispers, now listened in silence as Sarah confidently argued her case. Each word she spoke carried authority, every point delivered with precision. From the back of the room, a group of law clerks who had been observing the proceedings scribbled notes furiously. This, they realized, was a masterclass in professionalism and perseverance, how to respond to bias with grace while holding the system accountable. By the time Sarah finished her first case, the courtroom's mood had shifted entirely. Judge Henderson, visibly rattled, listened more carefully than before, asking measured questions and refraining from his earlier condescension. Each time Sarah stood to speak, the other attorneys paid rapt attention, and even the gallery sat straighter, as if recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. At the end of the morning session, Judge Henderson addressed the courtroom with unusual solemnity. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice quieter but steady this time, "I'd like to apologize for the events that transpired earlier. My actions were uncalled for and unprofessional." The room collectively held its breath. Such admissions were rare, especially from a judge of Henderson's stature. He turned slightly, as though addressing everyone present. "Bias, whether intentional or not, has no place in this courtroom. It's a lesson I'm ashamed to say I've been reminded of today." Sarah, still standing at the defense table, nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. With your permission, I'll prepare for the afternoon docket." "Yes, of course," Judge Henderson replied, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "We'll resume after the lunch recess." As Sarah gathered her files and walked out of courtroom 3B, the packed gallery began to stir again. Fellow attorneys offered quiet words of support as she passed, while defendants and their families watched her with newfound respect. Outside the courtroom, news of the incident had already begun spreading through the courthouse halls. A young black law clerk whispered to her colleague, "Did you see how she handled that? That's exactly the kind of lawyer I want to be." By lunchtime, Sarah Thompson's poised handling of the morning's events had become the courthouse's main topic of discussion. Whispers floated through hallways, echoing in every office, break room, and courtroom. In the public defender's office, her colleagues gathered, recounting the moment with a mix of pride and admiration. "Did you hear what happened in courtroom 3B? One attorney murmured to a paralegal. "She handled it like a pro, cool, calm, and collected." Henderson didn't know what hit him. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in her office with a half-eaten sandwich in front of her, sifting through case notes for the afternoon. The buzz outside didn't distract her. Years of juggling multiple clients, tight deadlines, and courtroom chaos had taught her how to stay focused. Her phone vibrated, another message of support. This one was from a young public defender from another city who had heard about the incident. "What you did this morning inspires me. We've all been there, but you turned it into something powerful. Thank you." Sarah leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had faced moments of bias before, but this felt different. The weight of so many eyes on her, watching, learning, reminded her of why she had chosen this path. Meanwhile, Judge Henderson sat alone in his chambers, his lunch untouched. The morning's events replayed in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. He had prided himself on being strict but fair, on running a disciplined courtroom where no one dared defy his authority. And yet, Sarah Thompson's steady voice and quiet confidence had revealed something he couldn't ignore, a blind spot he didn't realize he had. 30 years on the bench, he muttered to himself, staring out the window. And still I made such a fundamental mistake. On his desk, a pile of case files sat untouched. Instead, he picked up a photo of his grandchildren, their smiling faces staring back at him. What would they think if they'd seen him this morning? What would he tell them about fairness, justice, and equality if they asked? The knock on his door startled him. His clerk entered hesitantly, holding out a printed email. "Your Honor, there's some attention on this morning's session. The Chief Judge wants to speak with you before the day's end." Judge Henderson nodded slowly. He knew what was coming. Accountability. The afternoon session began quietly, the mood in Courtroom 3B noticeably different from earlier. Defendants, attorneys, and spectators all seemed hyper-aware of the significance of the morning. Sarah, now back at the defense table, continued her work with the same unflappable professionalism she had displayed earlier. As she presented her clients' cases, Judge Henderson listened with unprecedented care, asking thoughtful questions and ensuring that every defendant had their voice heard. It wasn't lost on anyone that his demeanor had softened. His gaze met Sarah's more than once, each time holding a glimmer of something new, perhaps respect, perhaps humility. During a brief recess, Sarah passed the bailiff, who offered her a rare smile. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "I've been working this courthouse for 15 years, and I've never seen someone handle a situation like that. You've got a lot of folks talking in a good way." Sarah thanked him and continued walking, holding her head high. The courthouse air felt different, lighter somehow. As the day drew to a close, Judge Henderson received a visit from Chief Judge Patricia Martinez in his chambers. She entered with a measured expression, her presence carrying the weight of authority. "Richard," she said as she took a seat, her tone firm but not unkind, "we need to talk about what happened this morning." Judge Henderson removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes wearily. "I know, Patricia. I made a mistake. One I can't take back." The chief judge nodded, placing a tablet on his desk. The screen displayed a social media post with thousands of shares, a video clip from the courtroom, clearly showing his harsh treatment of Sarah Thompson and her composed response. "This has spread beyond our courthouse. We can't pretend it didn't happen. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it?" Judge Henderson sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I want to make this right. Not just for Sarah, but for everyone." "Good," Judge Martinez said, her tone softening. "Because this is a chance to do something meaningful. Starting tomorrow, we'll be implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all judges and staff." "And Sarah?" Henderson asked. The chief judge handed him a handwritten note. "She's been invited to chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I suggest you offer her a personal apology, too." Judge Henderson nodded solemnly. Later that evening, as Sarah packed up her files to head home, a knock on her office door made her look up. Judge Henderson stood in the doorway, his face uncharacteristically humble. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I owe you an apology, not just for this morning, but for any assumptions I made about you. I was wrong." Sarah looked at him for a moment, searching his expression. She could see that the apology was sincere. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said evenly. "I appreciate you taking responsibility." Henderson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "I'd like to ask you something else. Would you consider serving as the chair of our courthouse's new Diversity and Inclusion Committee? I can't think of anyone better to help us make real changes." Sarah paused, the weight of the offer settling on her. She thought of all the young attorneys, those just starting out, those still fighting to be seen and heard. Finally, she nodded. I'll consider it, Your Honor. But real change takes commitment. It can't just be for show. It won't be, Henderson promised. The following morning, the courthouse hummed with a new energy. A memo had circulated overnight, notifying staff and judges of mandatory diversity and sensitivity training to begin within the month. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, some skeptical, some supportive, but no one could deny that the events of the previous day had sparked something profound. Sarah Thompson entered the building as she always did, confident, prepared, and professional. Today, however, her presence carried extra weight. Courthouse staff greeted her with nods of respect, their smiles more deliberate. At her desk in the public defender's office, Sarah found an email from Chief Judge Patricia Martinez formally inviting her to chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Attached were preliminary ideas for policy changes, training programs, mentorship initiatives, and bias reporting systems. Sarah read through the proposal carefully, her mind already envisioning the possibilities. Her supervisor, James Wilson, leaned against her doorframe with a grin. You've got Henderson sweating bullets, Sarah, he joked, holding up the memo. Mandatory training? A committee? That's big. Sarah smiled faintly, but didn't allow herself to relax. It's a start, James. But one memo won't fix everything. At 9 a.m., Judge Henderson stood before a packed courtroom, this time not to issue rulings but to deliver an apology. The room was unusually full. Attorneys, clerks, and courthouse staff had filtered in to witness what many believed to be an unprecedented moment. Sarah Thompson sat quietly in the defense section, her hands folded over her case files. Judge Henderson adjusted his reading glasses, his gaze steady, but his voice laced with humility. Yesterday, I made an error in judgment. I allowed my assumptions to cloud my actions, and in doing so, I disrespected an officer of this court, Miss Sarah Thompson. The room remained silent, every word registering deeply. Sarah watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. I have served as a judge for 30 years, Henderson continued, his voice steadying. But that does not excuse my behavior, nor does it mean I am beyond learning. Bias, whether conscious or not, has no place in our justice system. I failed to uphold that standard yesterday, and for that, I offer my sincere apology to Miss Thompson and to everyone present. The courtroom clerk lowered her head, visibly relieved as her unread email, the one Sarah had sent notifying the delay, sat like a symbol of the oversight. Sarah rose to address the judge, her voice clear and professional. Your Honor, I appreciate your apology. I also appreciate the steps being taken to ensure that what happened yesterday does not happen to anyone else. The statement carried weight, and Sarah could feel the silent approval of her fellow attorneys in the gallery. Judge Henderson nodded, acknowledging her professionalism yet again. Thank you, Miss Thompson. Let's proceed. Over the following weeks, Sarah balanced her caseload as a public defender while also chairing the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Meetings were held in the courthouse conference room, a space that had once been used only for routine administrative matters but now buzzed with conversations of change. Judges, clerks, attorneys, and even security personnel attended the sessions, sharing stories and ideas. Sarah led the meetings with purpose, her voice commanding attention while encouraging open dialogue. We can't fix what we don't address, she told the committee during the first session. Bias isn't always intentional, but its impact is real. Our job is to ensure that no one in this building feels like they don't belong. The group drafted new policies. A formal dress code clause prohibiting assumptions based on race, culture, or appearance. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all courthouse staff, including judges. A confidential bias reporting system for attorneys, defendants, and staff. Outreach programs to mentor minority law students and encourage diversity in the legal profession. Judge Henderson attended every session, often sitting quietly as others shared their experiences. At one meeting, a young black law clerk spoke up. Last year, I was mistaken for a defendant more than once, she admitted. It's not just about appearances. It's about respect. Henderson cleared his throat, visibly moved. "We need to do better," he said, his voice low but sincere. "And we will." As word spread about the changes at the courthouse, other legal professionals across the state took notice. Judges and attorneys began reaching out to Sarah for advice, requesting copies of the committee's policies and training materials. Legal journals dubbed it the Thompson effect, a term that symbolized how one moment of confrontation had led to widespread institutional change. Sarah also began mentoring law students from underrepresented backgrounds, sharing her experiences and offering guidance. During one such meeting, a young woman nervously asked, "Did you ever think about quitting?" Sarah smiled warmly. "Every hard day makes me stronger. The justice system isn't perfect, but we can't change it from the outside. You have to stand in those courtrooms, face the challenges, and demand the respect you deserve." Her words resonated, inspiring a new generation of attorneys to step into the legal profession with purpose and determination. Months later, the changes were undeniable. Sarah walked through the courthouse one bright morning and noticed subtle but significant differences. At the security checkpoint, officers treated everyone with equal professionalism, asking for credentials without assumptions. Judges and clerks greeted attorneys, regardless of race or gender, with respect, no longer making snap judgments based on appearances. In Courtroom 3B, Judge Henderson presided with a noticeable shift in demeanor. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and treated everyone who appeared before him with fairness. The courthouse walls, once indifferent, now displayed posters promoting dignity, respect, and inclusion. A plaque had been installed in the lobby, bearing an inscription that read, "Justice sees no color, gender, or creed, but we must ensure those who serve justice see and respect all." The words served as both a reminder and a promise to everyone who walked through the courthouse doors. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood at a podium at the courthouse's first annual Diversity and Justice Conference. Judges, lawyers, law students, and journalists filled the hall, eager to learn from her experiences. Behind her, a banner displayed the theme of the event: Equality and Justice, Changing Systems, Changing Minds. "When I walked into Courtroom 3B that day," Sarah began, her voice steady and powerful, "I didn't know that one confrontation would lead to this moment. Real change isn't just about policies, it's about changing hearts and minds. It's about ensuring that every person who enters these halls knows they will be treated with dignity and respect." The room erupted in applause. Judge Henderson sat in the front row, listening intently. Months of reflection and learning had transformed him into a vocal advocate for diversity and inclusion. In a later speech, he said, "Miss Thompson's professionalism reminded me that it's never too late to do better. We must constantly challenge our own biases if we are to uphold the integrity of justice." As the conference drew to a close, Sarah stood outside the courthouse, looking up at the building where she had faced so many challenges and victories. Her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman who had turned a moment of prejudice into a movement of progress. Nearby, a group of young law students watched her with admiration. One whispered to her friend, "That's Sarah Thompson. She's the reason this place changed." The sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the courthouse steps. Sarah knew the fight for justice was far from over. But this was a victory worth celebrating.